Well, I mean, we've seen, of course, the encroachment of capital in controlling the state. It's like the state's no longer regulating capital. Capital is regulating the state.
You're on Team Human, conscious intervention in the machine. An opportunity to stop competing for resources and building markets, but instead to think like a commoner. The commons ain't no tragedy, but a way beyond the illusion of scarcity. We may have been enclosed, but we can yet forge the solidarity we need to break free. I'm Douglas Rushkoff, and I'm on Team Human. Playing for Team Human today, activist, blogger, and director of the Reinventing Commons program at the Schumacher Center for a New Economics, David Bollier. David will be helping us see the sense and sensibility in learning, as his recently republished book puts it, to think like a commoner. It's time to intervene on behalf of people and all living things. I'm Douglas Rushkoff, and we're all on Team Human. Welcome to Team Human, David. I'm delighted to make your acquaintance.
A wonderful summary of the commons.
Our waterways are a commons, right? So it's in the spirit of managing that commons that I offer you a gift from our sponsor, Everyone's Earth. Get it? The Earth is a commons, Everyone's Earth. This is their first product, a 100% biodegradable cotton sheet, dryer sheet called Kobe. I was never a dryer sheet person, and I imagine you were not either, because I don't like the way they smell. But I feel like these ones made a real difference. And the beauty of this company is that they take everything into account. The way the cotton is grown, the way it's fabricated in a waste and pollution-free way, and that the product itself doesn't become landfill when it's done, but biodegrades completely back into organic material. Anyway, here's a box of Kobe dryer sheets for yourself or your dryer sheet using loved ones. And thanks for being on Team Human. Could you share your kind of easiest, best definition of the commons?
Sure. The commons is essentially can happen anywhere when people get together and say, we want to manage this bit of shared wealth with basic fairness, participation, and long-term equity. And we want to do it in a way that it can survive and defend itself against the inevitable incursions of capital or the state.
And then what's like a simple example of a commons in action?
Well, indigenous people are probably the pioneers of showing the effectiveness over millennia, but land, water, farmland, forest, fisheries, wild game are the classic ones. But of course, that suggests that it's an archaic historic thing only, when in fact commons are entirely contemporary. We see them in urban spaces. We see them in digital spaces. We see social service things like mutual aid networks. So it can happen anywhere. And that's really the beauty of it, when people get together and decide they're going to manage collective wealth for collective benefit.
So people who live around a lake and they decide, we want to manage the lake and the fish in it like a commons. What does that look like?
Well, it immediately gets complicated because there's usually a regime of private property already, and everything's been colonized and divvied up. So thence begins the complications of how we convert something that's proprietary and private into something that's for shared benefit, especially when the proprietary is exploiting us and creating concentrated political power and inequality.
But if they succeeded, what does it look like at the end, like a commons-managed lake?
Well, there's all sorts of varieties. It's not as if there's a single schema like the way free market ideology has a certain universal schema. It's going to vary depending upon what resource is being managed. Things like land or water can be used up. Things like digital code can be replicated for virtually no money. So it's going to vary depending upon the resource being stewarded.
But a classic an example of a commons would be, okay, here's a big pasture that maybe no one even owns, or it's publicly owned, whatever, and we're going to say that you're allowed to graze on it with your cows, but you can only have like 10 cows graze on it over 6 days every month, and we're going to limit it to that?
You're going to see, first of all, who's the participant in the commons who's going to step up and take responsibility and commitment. That's an important threshold. And then those commoners get to decide, well, we can allow these other outsiders to have these entitlements and rights as well because the pasture will not be ruined. There's all sorts of ways that people talk and negotiate and figure out how to effectively manage something for their benefit as well as for the long-term survivability of the resource.
I was with a friend. Am I allowed to tell you a story?
Please.
I was a friend. You could use it. Friend on the highway, libertarian. And we stop at this rest stop. And he says, he gets back in the car. He goes, you want to see the tragedy of the commons? Take a look at their bathroom. And I go in their bathroom, and there's like crap just like people have peed and pooped everywhere and done whatever. And I'm like, yeah, it's a disgusting bathroom. And he says, see, that's tragedy of the commons. Nobody cares. And I'm like, this is a privately owned bathroom that no one cares about in a thing, and it's like the first person who like poops on the seat, then no one else wants to get near the seat, so then they kind of pee further away from the seat, and the further and further away from this disgusting toilet people get, the worse it gets. But that's a tragedy of the commons?
Well, I mean, this is all started, it was repopularized in 1968 by this Garrett Hardin essay, The Tragedy of the Commons. But he wasn't describing a commons because a commons has a bounded community with rules, with punishments for those who break the rules. What he's talking about is the tragedy of the market, in which there are none of those rules, and in which individuals are invited to be libertarian jerks.
Right.
And so, there's this profound misunderstanding about the commons through the tragedy metaphor. And in fact, commons historically throughout millennia have been the default way of managing resources, whether it's land or water or wild game. And so we moderns need to rediscover the commons. And that's really the challenge.
Right. I mean, I think about how hard would it be today to convince, say, the American public or government to start the public library system?
Well, I mean, we've seen, of course, the encroachment of capital in controlling the state. It's like the state's no longer regulating capital. Capital is regulating the state. And we've seen that almost literally with Elon Musk being the co-president of Donald Trump's. I see the commons, however, as kind of a pre-state phenomena. In other words, all attention is not focused on, will the state do this for that? Will the law let us do that? It's a matter of taking stuff into our own hands. And we can do all sorts of commons right now without legal or other recognition from the state.
You mean just take charge of a waterway?
Well, we do get into certain negotiations,
Yeah.
but there's all sorts of CSA farms. There's all sorts of community land trusts. There's all sorts of digital commons and infrastructures that we didn't have to ask government for. Of course, once it gets to a certain size and starts to compete with the corporate proprietary versions or the owned property, we start to have some political conflicts. The state steps in. Capital and corporate interests start to flex their muscles. And we start to have a negotiation over whether the commons can exist or not.
Well, and it feels like, and maybe this is too conspiratorial a way of looking at it, but when I look at the way U.S. government, federal government is operating now, it looks like, these really wealthy people have come in order to really intentionally undermine what few institutions and government collectively managed resources and things we have, break them, so then they have to be basically corporations have to come in and buy up. We'll buy up that highway. We'll buy up that water system. Your whole thing doesn't work. Basically privatize these state institutions the way that happened like when the fall of the Soviet Union and all those things collapsed. Oligarchs came in and, the pre-oligarchs came in and bought those things and became the oligarchs. Is that what's happening?
That's exactly what's happening in the sense that, let's remember, the U.S. capitalist champions were the ones who were the architects of how the Soviet Union became given over to the oligarchs. They knew that the privatization would increase their own corporate possibilities. And we're seeing, after 40, 50 years of neoliberalism, the consummation of that fantasy of taking over collective resources and trying to discredit them. Because let's face it, a commons or collective action, whether it's through the government or by ourselves, is a form of competition with the proprietary world.
So then, not to sound like Bannon or early Trump, but we can look at post-leftist sort of neoliberal globalism, the World Bank and IMF and development funds as, these ways of opening up these markets
Precisely.
to capitalism and helping people participate in the global market meant destroying collectively and government-owned or run stuff.
And I think it all backs up to the fact that we don't have an alternative theory of value to market price. And even liberals and a lot of progressives say, oh, yeah, the market can do this and the state will intervene to make it a little more humane or a little less destructive. But go down that route enough and all the non-market value gets colonized, whether it's your consciousness, whether it's nature, whether it's the care work that we provide. It all gets marketized.
But that's because we don't have metrics for spirit, for care, for compassion, for those things, and maybe putting metrics on them. We don't want to put metrics on them. Putting metrics on them is sort of entering them into the eugenics game.
And we see precisely the self-deceptions from those metrics in regenerative finance or carbon offsets. You think that can substitute for the analog behaviors of nature, and it can't. And I mean, that's where I think the commons comes in, because the commons is the steward of the analog complexity of life. And I see living systems as generative in their own right, whether it's an ecosystem, an open source community, a gift economy, an academic discipline. But those have very complex and different time horizon dynamics than a market, a transactional market of individual interest, which can't even conceptualize a collective interest beyond the so-called invisible hand.
Right. So we're stuck trying to make, and this is where we get in the trap, we're trying to make a market-based argument for a non-market-based thing.
Well put. And I mean, that's why, frankly, we need to jump the tracks of some of this conventional thinking. And I'm afraid to say that many of my progressive lefty friends aren't able to do that, or they're still into the Marxist revolution paradigm or the frontal assault on capitalism through the state. And we've seen how taking over the state in Greece or in Bolivia hasn't worked.
Right. That's why I keep trying to tell them, I want to double down on the social of socialism and leave the ism, leave the ism behind.
Well, I mean, I do think now that we're in Trump 2 territory and it's somewhat chilling authoritarian dimensions, that we need to go back to rethinking things at the cellular level. And we've seen, I think, a lot of spontaneous innovation, like mutual aid networks. That's, the state's not going to help us. We have to help ourselves. And I think there's a lot of grassroots rethinking about how we're going to engage with politics as opposed to writing to my congressperson who doesn't have a clue about how to deal with this problem.
Right. And that's where I feel like there's our opportunity for sort of a blue state, red state solidarity.
Well, I've thought about this a lot. So many people think of politics in terms of confronting the state. But when I've thought about the commons, conservatives should like the fact that it's for a community. Libertarians should like it that there's room for individual initiative. Progressives should like it because it deals with inequality. And liberals should like it because it deals with social injustice. So I think it scrambles the ideological analysis and gets to a more basic interpersonal level and local level, which we need to get to anyways for climate change, of how we should what kind of social relations we should have and how we can move forward to create through those relations a different kind of politics.
Right, because I think like the traditional Montana cattle rancher, right, would easily and prefer, rather than having the state or the governor telling them what to do, to have a meeting with the other ranchers. Here's how we're going to deal with such and such. My runoff going on your thing and this and that, and here's how we're going to make this work.
There's a famous book, actually, by a property professor, Robert Ellickson, called Order Without Law, about cattle ranchers in the Shasta area of California who precisely do that through shaming those who don't keep their cattle on the land, who get off loose and destroy other people's property. They self-manage themselves. And I think that has to be a starting place, which is not to say there's not a suitable role for the state for all sorts of things, but we do need to empower people's self-organizing potential. And I think it has enormous creative dimensions, as we've seen on the internet, which has empowered so much bottom-up creativity and responsibility. But you do need some top-down macro rules, you might say.
Right. I mean, that was the interesting thing. As an internet kid, I was a shareware kid. I was one of the kids who would be on the back of the school bus, and we were sharing 5.25-inch floppies of games. And every once in a while you'd mail $5 to the person who made the game because you're like, oh my God, this is cool.
Right.
But it was a shareware universe, and we understood the internet as a commons, right? That the government sort of had made it, but now we were all going to kind of take care of it in this distributed way because no one wanted it. The market didn't even want it. It was like schools and things and rules and protocols.
Well, the market hadn't figured out how to monetize it yet.
Right.
And the commoners, for their part, didn't preemptively devise ways to protect what the value they were creating.
We had no idea. And because our leader was someone like John Barlow, who, bless his heart, as a Grateful Dead lyricist, was also a libertarian and, wrote the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace and said, government, stay away. Right. And we kids didn't realize you get rid of government, you're basically saying corporations come hither.
Yes. And I think this points to what I've come to describe as the onto shift, the ontological shift that has to happen, where we get out of our just individual mentality and start to think more broadly about our social relations and the collective interest of our commons. Because until we do, we're sitting ducks for being picked off by the corporate interest who will just try to do what social media has done. Turn us into isolated individuals, use algorithms to manipulate our behaviors, and monetize it all.
Right. And then it leads to this individualistic thinking even among the best of our friends. I mean, and I understand, especially they feel, going into authoritarianism and we see, a Palestinian get picked off and Venezuelan or an El Salvadorian get picked off. And they're thinking, when they come for me. So they're like, I'm going to write really aggressive blogs, but buy some land in Portugal, or make sure my visa for Canada is working.
Or colonize Mars.
Yeah, well, that's the other side of it, right? That's the ones who know what they're doing. But there's an individualism even among the most progressive thinking people. Once we get scared enough, we start thinking about our individual protection, which then further erodes our commonality.
And therefore, trying to make peace with the fact that the human species is in this web of interdependence. And, Martin Luther King Jr. had this famous quote that we're caught in this web of interdependence. And I think the great religious and spiritual leaders say the same thing. We don't really take it serious enough in modern secular capitalist world to think that, oh, yeah, we actually are dependent on the earth in profound ways. And maybe we should start behaving that way, and our institutions should begin to think that way. Because I guess the Marxist term is that we have this metabolic rift between the economy and earthly biological systems.
Right. And or a natural rift between human systems and all the other systems.
You're right. That's part of it as well, because we're all parsed into individuals who are supposedly atomistic, individual, utility maximizing machines. And that's what a consumer is. That's what an employee is. And this whole mindset, I think, has had profound implications in separating us from each other. And I think brilliantly, the right has learned how to make a sense of belonging into this national spectacle.
Right.
A friend of mine went to a Trump rally once, and he came back. He said, he's not right wing at all, but he said it was fun. And
it's like going to a fish show or something.
Something. Yeah. And I think that we don't have enough vehicles, whether on the large scale or at a smaller scale, for establishing real, authentic connection and realizing, oh, yeah, we are dependent on our neighbors and community.
Right. But that connection they're doing is a kind of uncommitted connection that still supports the myth of the individual.
Of course.
Right? So if you are an individual and you are allowed to take as much from the limited resources as you want, you keep going, then you have to either believe that the planet is infinitely regenerative, or that you're going to get to keep going. I mean, my tech bros, the only way they're able to justify it, because they're smarter, is to say, oh, okay, I get it. The Earth is limited. Climate change is happening, but I'm a superhuman. So I'm one of the ones who's going to use the fuel of this people and planet to get to the next place, to upload, to move on. This is just the dung heap.
This fantasy of denial. And I mean, let's just admit it. Standard economics continues to talk about externalities as if you can externalize cost and ecological destruction to somewhere else.
Exhaust.
It's
an exhaust pipe. It's behind you, right?
And I think that's why this is really a profound shift we're in the middle of, to realize that we are not third-party neutral observers of this. We are immersed as participants. And our subjectivity is not different from the objectivity. They're all kind of intermingled. And that's why I think there's kind of what philosopher Bruno Latour said, we're in this epistemological delirium. We don't know which way is up. We don't quite know how to think because the standard ways are not working, but we don't have the new ones yet.
Right. And maybe the new ones are kind of old ones. And that's – I kind of want to – now that Pope Francis has just passed, lots of my email believes he was assassinated at the last minute, which –
Well, we do know who visited him.
I know, my God. But I love – not that would have happened, but I love that they've generated so much paranoia in their own constituency that people would then go back. It's like you reap what you sow.
Well, I mean, I think that this is symptomatic of our disorientation and confusion.
Right.
And we have this compulsion, correctly so, to make sense of the world. And unfortunately, conspiracy theories come to mind more readily than complex ones.
But the reason I wanted to bring up the Catholics was, for many of us who didn't even yet know about indigenous commons, the Catholic Church was the commons, right? There's the Catholic Church at the medieval commons, and then along came the Protestants and enclosure and corporatism. That's sort of Marshall McLuhan's eye view of the fall of Europe. The printing press and industrialization destroyed the beautiful Catholic commons. I mean, was the Catholic commons so beautiful? I mean, they weren't that nice about it, were they?
No, but let's give them credit.
Yeah.
They did acknowledge the mysteries of human existence and have rituals to honor that. Mm-hmm. Whereas the stripped-down Protestant world, which became secular, which became capitalist, lost a lot of that. And I think there is a legitimate yearning for acknowledging the mystery of human existence. I don't believe some of that approaches, but I do think there are some interesting theologians talking about how biological systems give rise to this mystery through interdependence, and it's not just this cut and dried Newtonian mechanistic approach.
So but then that sort of, and we'll call it mystical, complex experience of reality went hand in hand with a commonsing approach
Well,
to
let's just
stuff?
say, let's not say there's not a universal commons template. There are
Right.
varieties of schools of thought and practice about the commons. And, some people say, well, let me just clarify that mafia and gangs might be said, oh, there's the commons. But I think that those are hierarchical, top-down, power-directed things. But I think there's lots of, it's not as if there's straight up black and white definition. This is a commons, this isn't.
Right.
It's more of a dimmer switch where there's elements of participation, bottom up, legitimacy, and so forth. And, the Catholic Church, let's face it, is a hierarchical institution. It's not, at least the Protestants and the Unitarians and many others had bottom-up participation in what the theological approach and nature of worship was going to be about.
Right. But so the church owned land. It wasn't a commons, really.
Well, I think inside the common, in a lot of monasteries, for example, there was elements of commons going on there. There was certain structure and hierarchy, but at the same time, people were mindful of the ordinary person and having a role.
But when they said the famous enclosure of the commons in the Renaissance was what?
Well, that was, the king disbanding a lot of those monasteries and enclosing them for purposes of capitalist accumulation. That's what happened to a lot of English monasteries and religious orders. So, I think there's always people trying to enclose something that is openly shared. And I think part of the challenge is for commons to develop perimeters, not in the sense of being a tight wall, but a semi-permeable membrane where they can let good stuff and nutrients and energy in, but protect themselves from poisons or people who might want to disrupt or vandalize the commons.
So you're saying almost like a biomimicry.
Exactly. Like the blood-brain barrier, where the brain can keep out certain toxins, but can allow nutrients and other good stuff in. I think any commons, therefore, is not like a property boundary, like this is mine and that's yours. It's more like it has interactions with the wider world, but on its terms, so that it can preserve itself as a social organism.
Right. I mean, that could be as simple as, a commons-based approach to even what kinds of businesses we let build stores. When a community says, we're looking at the track record, and I don't think we want a Walmart here.
Well, in medieval times with markets, they actually had rules to prevent speculators from just coming in first thing and dealing with all the goods. And they had means to allow the poor to buy first, for example. Or it was called a stinted commons, where they had certain rules for how you could access the market or how the market would operate. And it was sort of a more frank acknowledgement that markets are accountable to the community, something that modern regulation has attempted to do, but we've seen how that's been
or even
mixed.
Salvation Army. I mean, it sounds this is too stupid a story. But Salvation Army that I would go to find clothes and stuff, and other friends of mine, it eventually got run over. Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock, the new stuff's up, and there's professional eBay people going in there, grabbing the stuff. And it's like...
That's a great example. And, I'd pull the thread on that to say, let's talk about when it's socially okay to monetize stuff and when it's not.
Right.
When one of the game-winning balls of the World Series in Boston, somebody got it and sold the ball for $1 million. Well, is that okay ethically? And there was a huge uproar among the fans about this guy privately monetizing the game-winning ball. And I think...
Well, it depends who it was. The guy who caught it?
Or the guy who caught it. And I mean, it's an interesting discussion about think of getting celebrity signatures. That's become a little mini industry in itself.
Right.
And it's like, when is it okay to monetize and when not? Let's have a discussion about that, and let's have means for enforcing that.
Right. Or at least shaming it.
At least shaming it. Okay, the law as law can only do so much, and maybe the law is going to overreach in its universality. But let's have an social ethical discussion about what's okay to marketize and what's not. And we've seen how there's been no discussion, relatively, for the private data information about us through social media.
I know, and that's something that most of us didn't even realize would be a market. And it's the interesting thing about that market is that information about me is not really worth anything to anybody. My information is only worth something in aggregate. So you would think that would sort of trigger some commons mental structures.
This is where the cynicism or dishonesty of the libertarian analysis comes in, because they say, "Oh, let's create a market so you can get so much money if you
maintain sovereignty over your data."
Exactly.
Right.
And of course, ignoring the fact that it's only the collective aggregation of it that creates value. My individual data is virtually worthless. So they're playing both ends of the game.
Right. No, it's like those things. Do you ever get those letters like, "Oh, there's a class action lawsuit against your cell phone carrier and your benefit signed here and whatever." And if you could go through all these processes, you may get like 37 cents, but those lawyers are getting half of the entire settlement.
Exactly. And I think that this is, again, emblematic of our individualistic approach to things and not being able to think collectively and relationally.
I was on the subway the other day. Someone across from me said, "Hey, you're the Kobe dryer sheets guy." Well, not exactly. I am the Kobe dryer sheets guy, or one of them, but it was actually a Team Human listener who was asking, "Why the heck are you hawking dryer sheets on Team Human?" And it's weird. I was like, "Did you listen to the ad?" And you'd know. I've been looking for a sponsor for like 10 years is the thing, and I couldn't find a sponsor that I could actually speak about honestly because they were doing awful things. And this guy, Tom, who makes Kobe dryer sheets, actually cares about the world. This is a product that's meant to be the first step in our reclaiming industry and consumerism for people and the environment and the earth. So these are 100% biodegradable, natural, environmentally soundly made dryer sheets, and the beginning of what I'm hoping is a consumer revolution against crap and plastic and evil and toward good. Right. So there's all these different kinds of commons. I mean, so many of the different things I've cared about. I mean, honestly, from local currency to mutual aid to sharing communities to couch surfing are all forms of commons, right?
Precisely. And I mean, one of my favorites is these tech people who are people with diabetes. The medical industry wasn't creating cell phone apps with insulin delivery that was customizable for a person. And they developed their own open source system for doing that. And there's a lot of things that are like that where markets, because they're so concentrated and big, say, nah, it's not profitable enough for us. But commons can often do that in ways that not only markets are not serving, but are doing it in more sensitive, humane, quality-driven ways.
Right. Or the extractive exponential growth mandate of an industry has made it so expensive that they've created the opportunity for a commons. Like, the elder care network in Japan, when people couldn't afford healthcare, they start trading hours. They created basically a commons of healthcare hours. You take care of my grandmother, I'll take care of yours.
Sort of like time banking, which also does that in a larger way. But I mean, that points up how commons tragically are often kind of free R&D for the capitalist world to exploit once it reaches a certain scale or provability as a success. And Couchsurfing, which you mentioned, is an example where this was an international travel hospitality network that was a gift economy without market exchange. At a certain point, had such a scale they needed some money to run it. They turned to or acceded to venture capitalists. And now it's basically a travel service.
Well, and it got replaced by Airbnb ultimately anyway.
Also true. But I think that it would have had a fighting chance had it had the means to protect itself as a commons at an international scale.
But we keep not knowing is the thing. And partly it's because wide-eyed, optimistic, friendly, hippie kids like me start doing something and it's fun. Oh, we're going to share pot. We're going to be on the net. We're going to have raves and charge no money and just dance in a field. And we don't understand what we're actually doing.
And that's why I've gotten into the commons. I've been through a lot of those trips. I've been through a lot of the liberal let's protect ourselves through the state approaches. And I think that we need to get smart about the commons, as a social system that needs to protect itself, whether through technology, through law, through social shaming, or whatever other means, as opposed to letting that be the run-up to, I'm a junior capitalist, I'm going to make a ton of money.
Right. I mean, it's like it's hard to know what legal system can even protect it. I guess property rights of some kind.
Well, what's so interesting is once you get beyond Western jurisprudence, you find that indigenous people, traditional communities, and global South communities are doing this. In fact, many of them find the Western norms, the outgrowth of John Locke and others about property, to be insane. That my colleague and I developed the idea of relationalized property, the way it's not as if you have absolute dominion and exclusivity over something. You have these porous boundaries in which, under certain terms, as agreed by the community, you can use something. And so it's a different frame. Now, whether Western jurisprudence can ever graduate out of or modify itself is maybe another issue. But there are all sorts of living examples of different ways of treating property.
Right. I mean, my friends at there's a group called A Land for All in the Israel-Palestine conflict and all. And they're trying to talk about a way of reconciling or helping people live together by not – it's like it's not one nation, it's not two nations. It's just we stop thinking about it quite like that.
Yeah.
We kind of share this land.
And I think that is the nub of what needs to evolve because let's face it, private property as reinforced through the capitalist system of making money through private property imposes certain social relationships and imposes certain individual identities that prevent us from thinking relationally about each other, thinking that we have to take account of each other's needs and interests. And I think property law lies at the heart of a lot of that. And so we need some legal innovation. I often talk about legal hacks, the way Creative Commons licenses or the general public license for free and open source software have helped open up a different kind of relationality among people in creating stuff. So those are the kinds of things we need to start to explore more.
Right. And do you have hope that the newfound pressures or the new realizations of how both – I mean, I think most people are in that haze right now, but when they see that both neoliberalism and Muskian authoritarianism it both lead to the same extracted, devastated death.
I think, yes, with the proviso that there's been a real scarcity of intellectual, philosophical, political thinking about these alternatives. I think so many people are still within the liberal capitalist reservation that they're not able to entertain these heterodox ideas. And I think there's a real urgent need for that to happen. I mean, we know the authoritarian world has its own think tanks, constitutional scholars, and all the rest developing these philosophical frameworks. What do we have for the commons or other alternative regimes?
Well, we got you and the Schumacher Center. And,
there are a hearty set of bands.
There's three good places.
I'm just saying that while there are important pockets of action going on, we don't have the depth, we don't have the robustness that I think the Commons needs to develop to propagate this as a viable, if not compelling, philosophical framework. And I think we're on the cusp of a lot of it. There's a lot of legal scholars in Europe especially who are very interested in this topic.
Right. Well, in Europe, they're looking. I mean, especially now. I think in some ways, I spent a little time in Europe since our new administration came in, and there's a healthy renewal of sort of this sense of moral intellectual leadership.
And when I travel to Europe and then come back, I'm keenly aware of how unique and isolated the U.S. is from the rest of the world. And it's because of our scale that we're able to get away with that. Whereas there's a lot of cross currents in law, political scholarship, political action that we're mostly ignorant of. And I think that we need to sort of key into, because I think they hold some clues and keys to how we might reinvent ourselves in these very difficult times.
Right. I mean, part of it is because so many of the places we live are markets. We don't take responsibility for them. I was in a grocery store in the city, and I saw somebody, pushing around their cart, and they just had something that they didn't want anymore. They didn't want to buy anymore, and they just put it on whatever the closest shelf was. And I know they're thinking someone's being paid they'll see it and they'll move it to the right place. But I always go back to where it was and put it in the thing.
It reminds me of a story I heard about Danish people who, they're a prosperous country in Europe, but they turn off the water when they're not brushing their teeth or when they are brushing their teeth.
Right.
And other minor things like that, which has a certain mindfulness that we're in a scarce, interdependent world, because they know that other people need that water too, and they don't have the sense of limitless abundance that we Americans do.
Right. I mean, even, I go to rest stops now, in the car, and you get your tray and whatever, and it's like, where do I put it? And they go, oh no, you just leave it on the table. We'll get to it. And it's like, okay, but I'm just used to, because that was, and I'm sure it's better on some level. Who knows?
Well,
There's more room.
I think the pandering hedonism of capitalism that, we'll take it, we'll do it, everything. Just give us the money.
Right. Give us, and they don't want you to worry about what you're throwing away, maybe, because when you throw it away, you think how much. You just leave shit everywhere. But that's the way of moving. Just move through life. The exhaust pipe's behind you. You just poop and leave your garbage. And you go to some cities where it's really clean, and it's not because they're rich or because they have laws against littering. It's just because there's a sense of, I don't want to say ownership. There's a sense of stewardship.
Well, I think I've thought about this a lot, and I think it comes down to we are so focused on individual, transactional, and material interests that we're not able to think in a collective relational way about and interdependent ways on other people. And this is so deeply ingrained in American culture that it's hard to get out of. It's hard to get a beachhead of alternatives.
But then is the way, and this I guess is always my big life question, is the way out that things get worse so that we're forced to, or do things have to get better and so that we calm down? The more fear there is, and there's more fear now than there was before, as the market goes down, your 401k goes down, people don't think, my 401k is going down, I better learn community so that people want to take care of me when I'm old. I'm going to fight community and try to get more money in my account before I get old.
Yeah, I sort of think it's going to be – I understand what you're saying, but I've come to adopt this belief that Václav Havel, when he was a cultural dissident in Czechoslovakia in the 70s, was asked, how do you deal with a totalizing system that you cannot be rationally persuaded or be subject to civil negotiation? And he said, you have to develop a parallel polis. And I think that because that will allow you to speak the truth without being co-opted immediately. You'll be able to develop a prefigurative horizontal relationships of how the world should be. And this will help you survive. It'll help you build the seeds for the new order. And I think we're kind of in a corresponding space right now that we need to, as a personal matter of not turning into stone, develop these horizontal relationships of conviviality, satisfaction, even spiritual renewal through horizontal relationships. Forget what's going on. Don't forget. We still need protest and resistance, but keep that separate from building this relational horizontal order.
Right. I mean, that's so much what I've been talking about since things have gotten this strange. And I get a lot of pushback, but I'm saying, look, when AOC or Naomi Klein or someone tells me to get out on the street, and I'll go, I'll be there, I'm going to do that. But the majority, the 90% of my effort is going to be spent on engendering mutual aid and social connections and taking care of people in my neighborhood. And it's not an ostrich in the sand thing.
Yes. Let's talk about what is the regenerative new order we want to build, as opposed to stop doing that, stop kicking me, stop, state do this. It's like, what are we going to do ourselves to be at a cellular local level that matters to us, a new vision for the world?
Right. But the pushback I get when I say something almost exactly like that is, yeah, but free Palestine.
Well, this is part of you're all about team human.
Right.
Let's talk about our shared humanity. And obviously Palestine is part of that conversation. But I think that we can get sucked into the vortexes of some of these issues in ways that we simply become caricatures barking at each other.
Right. And if you start looking systemically, you can say, okay, right now, at least as far as America is concerned, Palestinian lives are most valuable to the market as fodder for U.S. weapons. Right? So what can we do here in America in the economy and the way this place works so that we don't want to profit off the deaths of those people?
Which is why I think reigniting the dignity of human encounter and rehumanizing things is also a part of this conversation. It's not just the realpolitik of brokering at the state level or the corporate level how things work. It has to be about asserting this alternative bottom-up vision of humanity. And of course, the Palestinian conversation is part of that.
But then it's like we're in the position, and I don't mean this in a bad way, we're in some ways I feel like I'm in the position of a rabbi or really or an MLK or even a Marianne Williamson or somebody, that it's about and not to do whatever spiritual bypassing is, but to reawaken basic human compassion so that people can't function in this way anymore.
Yes, and the addition I would add to that is let's give some institutional forms for people to cultivate that. I mean, those compassion, trust, treating people with respect and dignity is a muscle that has to be developed. And we need institutional forms. And I see the commons as a way to help develop that socially as opposed to just slipping into the familiar market consumerism and individualism.
Maybe this is a good moment. It's a good moment because I'm feeling emotional. And when I do, I want to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Everyone's Earth, for supporting this show and everything we're trying to accomplish. The first of their environmentally friendly, completely biodegradable products, Kobe dryer sheets, are available at kobedryersheets.com. I poked around the dryer sheet world online, and there are tons of things claiming to be clean or plant-based or natural, but nothing that actually approaches the rigor of Kobe. I know the guy who started the company, Tom Kalish, and he is just fucking relentless. This is a take no prisoners approach to sustainability, where nothing is good enough if it doesn't take the whole planet and the whole life cycle of the product into account. And it's just the beginning. So please support Kobe dryer sheets now. Get biodegradable diapers later this year, and Team Human in your podcast feed. After all, the planet is a commons. It is everyone's Earth. I like the name of the thing. Everyone's Earth kind of says Earth is a commons. Oh, it's everyone's. I mean, it's possessive still. But and finally, it's not everyone's. I mean, everyone includes Gaia. Everyone includes the ants.
I just get allergic to some marketing speak when I see some of the players who use that marketing speak.
I know, Whole Conscious Capitalism and the Whole Foods guy who wrote that book. And that's the other thing. So many of the people that respond the most favorably to what we're talking about are recent converts. It's funny because they're the most dangerous people in Judaism too at a synagogue. The recent convert, because they believe more than the rabbis do in this stuff. They take everything so literally. But recent converts. So I know people who are like investors or, they already have their millions of dollars. And then they've gone to South America and done a good ayahuasca trip and come back. The environment is all that matters and all. And it's and then they talk about regeneration and buy a book and this. It's what do we do with these people?
Well, it's, I think, a classic case of cheap grace, where they're not having to surrender their systemic identities, and they're able to somehow make this transition. And that's where I part company, because I think we do need institutional shifts and changes in our relationships with each other. So, I get depressed at some of the sophisticated varieties of self-deception that we have.
Right. So does the institution or even does the commons come first, or does rapport and solidarity come? If you're raised in a commons world, you end up with rapport and solidarity. I knew
you start to develop it. You start to try to align yourself despite differences. It's not as if you start in total unanimity. You start to negotiate your differences with respect around a shared goal and objective. And over time, that evolves. You make mistakes. You have conflicts. It's not as if it's a utopia. But when you see a successful commons, it's almost sublime and beautiful, the way people have come together despite their obvious differences.
Right. So you would say you could start a bunch of people who don't agree and they're not friends and they don't have community, whatever. We've got this lake. Everyone wants to fish. Let's have a meeting.
That's exactly what – and I see this in a lot of different realms. There's this lake, the Loch Ness in Ireland, where they're trying to do that right now, is to try to treat it as a commons, meaning socially managed, despite a wide variety of players who have an interest in it. And I think you see this whether we're talking about urban spaces, digital code spaces, many others, where people realize that there's a shared resource. I like to call it care wealth because it's a different category than a resource. They have shared care wealth that they want to manage for their mutual benefit. And I think that's the classic dynamic of commons.
How did commons – I know this is kind of fantasy zombie war thinking, but how did commons ultimately protect themselves from warlords? If we're commonsing around a lake and doing our fishing and all that, and all of our skills are based in how we share our fishing utility, and then these other guys' specialty is having a bazooka on the back of a Bradley.
Well, you raise a great point. I think that, first of all, I've come to recognize that there are some profound differences between state power and commons that have to be negotiated. They have different worldviews and priorities. The state wants to centralize power. It wants to regularize itself through uniform rules. It wants to take credit for everything. Commons are naturally grounded in diversity and difference, and a lot of European cities are trying to experiment with what they call commons public partnerships, where the city realizes that it could benefit from the creativity, the trust, the legitimacy of commons, but it needs to enter into a good faith negotiation with them in developing new forms, as opposed to the bureaucratic edict or commands that it's accustomed to. So there's some experimentation between what state-commons relations should be like. But your larger point is absolutely accurate. The corporate world and the state are more powerful, and the commons will be vulnerable to them. They've often existed at the sufferance of those powers or in the interstices protected from them. So that's an unresolved issue.
Right, and it's tricky. Or if our society is collapsing and we're moving into just a distributed array of self-governed groups, the commons will also have to work on their common defense.
Well, let's play with that a moment. I think that bioregionalism is the future. The economies are going to have to be more bioregionally grounded if we're going to deal with some of the carbon and other ecological issues. And that implies different forms of bioregional governance and control. So there's going to be some conflicts and negotiation with the conventional nation state in doing that.
But you don't envision, I can't imagine how a post-nationalist, post-governance world could happen at this point, not when we've got, nuclear reactors.
So you basically believe that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, meaning, the nation state's going to have to adapt if it's going to deal with the realities of planetary ecosystems.
But we're still going to need some institutions capable of operating at scale.
Absolutely.
Because we have big things.
But the question is, in whose interest at scale?
Right.
I think that there's all sorts of possibilities for what I call emulate and federate, meaning you keep the appropriate scale and grounding, but you still get the footprint and influence through this bottom-up swarming. You might say the way the digital world transnationally works.
Right.
And, so I think the nation state's going to have to sue for peace in certain ways or break through its own brittleness and imperiousness.
Right. We'll get distributism and subsidiarity. The things
one can hope, but we are on the threshold of something new, and I think let's just entertain that as opposed to being hostage to a lot of legacy ideas. After all, the Treaty of Westphalia, which created nation states as a regime, is only 500 years old.
Right.
And we are in a radically different space than then.
And we can do a lot of things using commonsing approaches. It doesn't just have to be how we manage something that we want. We could use a commons approach to manage nuclear waste.
I haven't thought about that one.
But you know what I mean? Like to say, okay, we have shared responsibility for these spent fuel rods of these even obsolete nuclear reactors.
Yes. I think we're going to have to think of what sovereignty means. That's a sort of like in play because territorial sovereignty is eroding through.
We're going to take Greenland, right?
Well, I'm just thinking how digital commerce itself and communication is eroding territorial control. And meanwhile, the climate is becoming a political actor saying, no, this is my political demands on your human economy. So something's going to have to give. And I think we would be wise to start to accommodate to some of these external realities on legacy systems.
Does that give you hope? This is a tricky moment.
Well, I don't even want to get into hope or not. I think there's no way past this except through. We have to realize we're at a novel, unprecedented moment. We need to entertain ideas that haven't been entertained in the past. We have to give up the fantasy that we're going to return to some previous normal, because the previous normal is not coming back.
Did you know laundry dryer sheets are actually plastic, and the first ingredient is crude oil? It's in your clothes, on your skin, and piling up in landfills. That's why we invented Cobi, spelled C-O-B-I. C-O for cotton and B-I for biodegradable. The first all-cotton, 100% biodegradable dryer sheet that works better than those toxic alternatives. No chemicals, no plastic. Just soft, static-free clothes that are safe for your family and the planet. Save 10% on your first order at CobiDryerSheets.com. That's CobiDryerSheets.com.
So meanwhile, you're like over 50. You're a professor?
No,
you're not. You're indie.
I just do my thing.
So then, do you like? I'm not allowed to ask. Do you like have a retirement account?
Well, let's just say we're all immersed in the capitalist system. It's not as if apart from becoming a member of a escapist community or cult, it's very difficult to get the sovereignty, at least in the U.S.
Right. You can go to Tamera in Portugal, and God knows how you might live.
Yeah. And so, I think there's a lot of hybrids out there. It's not as if it's some black and white either-or situation. But we need to start experimenting and innovating with alternative regimes. And I think that as things get worse, as new systems are proven, we're going to start to incubate alternatives.
Do you see ways for, those of us who do have, I got my TIAA CREF, teachers retirement plan thing that they try to put it in one version or another of an international stock fund, S&P, blah, 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 mixed bond, blah. I mean, so my whole retirement is depending on the destruction of the world, Have you seen ways, and I do this every time I'm on one of these Zooms with all these pro-economic, good economic people, are there alternative strategies for people? Can't they invest in, is there a way to put money in land trusts and CSAs? Or
there are, I think, financial advisors who sometimes specialize in that. I do think of, for example, Michael Schumann, who is a localist scholar who has written about how you can invest your retirement in local specific projects. And I'm sure there's concierge financial advisors who do this as well if you have enough money. But
that's the thing, if you have enough money.
But the point is, we don't have these alternatives, and maybe because maybe it's not been seen as dire enough, maybe because it's not been seen as lucrative enough.
Right.
We're creatures of the modern capitalist world, and it's hard to carve out an alternative.
But I do find that many of my friends who are pretty meticulous with their lives in most ways look at that and they just, that's back there, but I don't want to think about that one. And it's like, but in some ways, if we're living under capitalism and your home and your retirement, if you have one, are maybe high leverage points. If we got all of us, we could get a couple of $1 trillion in a different place.
But, we've already seen how, first of all, young people can't access home ownership anymore. And two, the long-term value of homes is not going to be increasing as much as the great acceleration starts to peter out. So, perhaps that's going to be opening up a shift for how people...
Right. If people start seeing that, which may have started already, to see their it's like you were never really invited to participate in that capitalistic game. Do you know?
Well, there was, I think, a great Onion headline, something like, suddenly rich people no longer have to pretend that they're in the public interest for everybody.
Right.
It's sort of like the masks are off, and we know that most people are sort of excluded from those benefits.
Yeah, there was this sort of GI Bill, Levittown, Teamsters, Yahtzee moment, 1947 to
1970 or so, 80 maybe with Reagan.
Right, where it was like, oh, look at that. I mean, Bretton Woods somehow worked out in all our favor,
Well, we do know about the quite deliberate approach by the, let's call them oligarchs, to create neoliberal capitalist policy, which essentially got inaugurated with Reagan, Thatcher in 1980 and has continued until it's fallen apart in the past few years.
Right.
So I think that's why we are at such disarray and confusion, because this whole arc is falling apart.
And then don't you see nationalism as like an early inkling, an early groping toward the commons, that they kind of understand, we need some kind of boundary condition in order for the circularity to happen?
Well, I think it's one of the only available categories for emotionally expressing that. I mean, I like to see the commons as a vehicle for having sovereignty without nationalism, for having social control without bureaucracy, for a lot of these alternatives. But as I say, we haven't developed some of these thought categories or cultural memes as alternatives to grow into. That's why I see the discourse of the commons is so valuable, because if it's popularized enough, people can say, I'm doing a commons. And even though I'm sharing seeds, I have a lot in common with code sharers who have a lot in common with land sharers and so forth. And we can start to culturally see the kinship among a lot of progressive projects instead of each of them being in their own nonprofit silo and brand identity.
Right, that they're all on Team Human, seriously.
Seriously, yes. And it's like developing some of these discourses. And then I would just add, not to be so common-centric, but there are lots of other movements the cooperative movement, the social solidarity economy, the donut economics approach, the degrowth world, the peer production and cosmo-local production world. There's lots of things going on which are, I don't want to collapse them into a single way of thinking, but they're all synergistic and need themselves to be working together more.
Right. They're all kind of trailheads to this more
Yes.
complex way of living. And complexity, I don't mean complicated. I mean this embrace of the complexity and sort of multifaceted, undefinable, unmarketable, unpriceable collaboration of species
And
here.
not quite yet, let's just say, packaged culturally yet. It's still seen as peripheral carping by fringe players, as opposed to the silent supermajority that hasn't expressed itself yet.
Right.
And I think that, you can have the modern Republican Party sort of have a deceptive bait and switch, but these alternatives, which are grounded, authentic alternatives, haven't quite coalesced, haven't quite found the leadership, haven't quite found the infrastructures and financing to assert their cultural dominance yet.
Right. Well, they haven't found a way to get on the screen. They're in the ground. Every friggin' piece of ground is filled with mycelia and every other collaboratively commonsing organism. It's the air we breathe, the water we touch. It just hasn't created an abstract symbol system to be represented in the media space.
That's well put. And I think that, however, there's the mysteries of the organism and how the organisms of human bodies with all sorts of embodied, situated knowledge has not been expressed yet or culturally recognized yet. But I think it's percolating. It's, Gaia is speaking to us through us.
Yeah.
And it hasn't quite manifested, and it'll be a sight to behold when it happens.
Yeah, I'm seeing it more and more as I walk down. Oh, that one's manifested. That one's manifested. Whether they went to an ecstatic dance night or did a little mushrooms or made love in a better way or helped an old person across the street.
Yeah, but let's just avoid, I guess Marcuse called it repressive desublimation. Let's avoid the rave degenerating into the next marketing opportunity.
Right. Right. By this time staying conscious of the values that we're actually engendering.
I mean, I sort of see the commons way of thinking as a beachhead for starting to have a more serious negotiation with the existing ways of thinking. And instead of being able to pick us off one by one or one movement at a time, you can start to have a more united front to say, you know what, we have some serious things to talk about changing how we do business in the world.
I mean, we can take a commons approach to our commenting.
And it's like I'm not audacious enough to predict how that's going to unfold, but I think there's enough of a meta discussion and negotiation that has to happen along the way.
Well, thank you. Thank you
Well,
for
thank
what
you
you
for
do.
having me, Douglas.
And thank you for being on Team Human. You can get David Bollier's book, Think Like a Commoner, 2nd edition, and check out his other writing and activities at bollier.org. You can become a supporter of Team Human by going to Team Human FM and clicking on support. Team Human is sponsored by Everyone's Earth and produced at MCM Creative in New York City. Our producer is Joshua Chapdelaine, and I'm Douglas Rushkoff. You've been on Team Human, our last best hope for peeps.